After Lillian, Ken's crush, got married, he tried to slit his wrists countless times. Every time, I saved him. Until one day, I got in a car accident trying to save him again and ended up in a coma. He felt no guilt at all, constantly telling me how much he loved Lillian. He said every boring day of our marriage just made him love her more. He also claimed that the female protagonist in his best-selling high school romance novel was based on Lillian. All that bittersweet affection, it was all for her. Had nothing to do with me. When I opened my eyes again, I was back in time to the day Ken hesitated to give Lillian his love letter. I gave him a push. Go on, after 12 years of a crush, who could love her more than you? Let's see how much you love her. In the dance studio, Lillian had just finished rehearsal and was joking with her friends while stretching. I returned, just in time to see Ken standing at the back door of the rehearsal room, staring at Lillian. His gaze was obsessed and wild. He had a love letter in hand. Without hesitation, I gave him a push from behind. Lillian, someone's looking for you. Is it Ken? What's up? Lillian walked over to Ken after she finished stretching. Ken clutched the love letter, hesitated, then eventually shoved it back in his pocket. Nothing, just wondering if you'd like a drink. I could get it for you. Thanks so much, she replied. Ken practically bolted away. I snorted. Even with a second chance, he was too chicken to confess his feelings. So why, in a past life, did he take all his regrets out on me? In that past life, after Ken and I got married, his romance novel about secret love in high school suddenly became a hit. He was constantly doing book signings. Coworkers once asked if I could get them a signed copy. Ken says the book's heroine is based on someone real. That's you, right? He had a crush on you for so long, and you never noticed? I remember texting Ken, asking him to sign a couple of books for my colleagues. But after hearing that, it threw me off. Ken confessed to me openly before dating. I shrugged it off. Novels blur the line between reality and fiction. That night, I overheard Ken arguing with his editor. I can't write the post-marriage sequel. If printing more copies depends on it, I'm not selling. His editor tried to coax him, you're married. Just write about your married life to satisfy the reader's curiosity. Can't do it, Ken snapped before hanging up. I assumed Ken was stressed. I offered to help write, after all, it was our life. None of your business, he suddenly barked. Seeing my shock, he apologized. Sorry, I'm just stressed. Don't take it to heart. I gave him space, didn't press it further. Later, during a book signing, Ken abruptly left, dazed. The editor couldn't reach him, so they called me. I couldn't find him either. Turns out, our high school security guard found him attempting suicide in a classroom, clutching a wedding invitation. After that, Ken stayed home, hurting himself. The doctor suggested he might be depressed, but Ken refused treatment. Every workday, I was on edge, monitoring him through cameras, rushing home if he tried to harm himself. Ken, when will you get better? I'd run to him, trying to stop him. He seemed to take pleasure seeing me so worried. This is how I felt too, all because of you. I thought it was his depression talking nonsense. In the end, trying to save him, I got into a haze and an accident happened that left me in a vegetative state. Tubes hooked up, lying in bed. I was conscious, able to hear but couldn't respond. Ken was there, instructed by the doctor to talk to me. But all he spoke about was Lillian. They're foolish, thinking the heroine was you. It was always Lillian. She's the lighthouse of my life. What married life? Lillian got married. To someone else. It explained why he refused to write that sequel. He cut himself because she got married. I wanted to scream at him, asking what our years meant. But I couldn't move. What's it like being married to someone you don't love? Every dull day with you makes me love her more. It felt like my heart was torn apart. He didn't care about the meals I brought him, saved him countless times, or my years of companionship. For years, it was only Lillian in his heart. When he visited daily, he'd still babble about Lillian. In the end, even blamed me. If not for you, maybe I'd have married Lillian. But what did that have to do with me? I didn't force him to chase me or to marry me. He made all those choices. He was cowardly, insecure, weak. But somehow, that was all my fault? I was just blinded by affection and sympathy, missing his act. Back to this life, sitting in class. Math class. The teacher, writing on the board, suddenly tossed a piece of chalk at Ken's desk. "Stop staring at that girl." The room went silent, everyone turned to Ken. Lillian elbowed me, her voice just loud enough for everyone to hear. "Hey, Ken's looking at you." The room erupted in teasing. I frowned, memories of the last life surfacing. Back then, Lillian often stuck by me. We weren't close, but we were chatty. Ken often hovered nearby. Lillian would say, "Ken's looking at you again." When I glanced back, I'd always catch Ken avoiding my gaze. He'd never say a word, never explained. Until Ken confessed, I never doubted his feelings for me. But why? Why did Lillian make it seem that way? I looked at Lillian. She returned my gaze with a perfect smile, but her eyes were ice cold. If it wasn't for her constantly egging me on back then, maybe Ken and I wouldn't have ended up together. I should thank her. I thought for a moment, then stood up. "How about this, teacher? I'll switch seats with Ken." Ken's eyes immediately lit up. But Lillian suddenly jumped up. "No. Lillian is the class president, always accommodating, with this good person image." Now, not caring about her persona, she directly refused. I asked innocently, "Lillian, don't you always say you hope everyone's grades improve in class? Your math is really good, and Ken struggles with it. If I switch seats, you can help him out. Or, do you just not like Ken?" Lillian glared at me with hatred. She needed to maintain her good guy image, so even if she was unwilling, she bit her lip and said reluctantly, "Of course not." All right, the math teacher knocked on the desk twice, perfect time for a little math study group. Ken, move to the seat next to the president after class. "President, keep an eye on Ken's math progress for us." Lillian's hands under the desk were practically digging into it, but she still managed to smile and say, "Okay, teacher." I chuckled. Overly fake, but entertaining to watch. When it was time to change seats, Ken couldn't suppress his smile and switched with me at lightning speed. Lillian pretended to sleep on the desk. Ken quickly picked up his workbook to block the light for her, worried it might disturb her nap. The way he looked at Lillian was so sincere and earnest, like she was a rare treasure. I remembered after our wedding in the past life, we flew to our honeymoon. On the plane, before I slept, I forgot to pull down the shade, and the glaring light woke me up. I half playfully complained, "Ken, why didn't you lower the shade for me?" Ken said flatly, "I didn't know you were asleep." How could he not know, when I was right next to him? A slight turn and he'd see me sleeping. But it wasn't that he didn't know, he just didn't care to know. I couldn't help but feel a bit sour, and I inhaled, telling myself, "Susan, it doesn't matter, it's all in the past. From now on, this person has nothing to do with my life." I refocused and picked up my pen to work on the test paper. The next class was supposed to be PE, but the homeroom teacher just said the PE teacher was absent, so it'd be self-study instead. Before leaving the classroom, the homeroom teacher turned back and said, "Susan, the student council reminded you to rehearse for the evening host role after school. Don't forget." Got it. I had previously competed for the host spot and won it with the highest score. But during the self-study class, Lillian suddenly leaned over her desk, her shoulders shaking as she cried. Ken clumsily tried to calm her down, but she refused to speak. Finally, they resorted to passing notes. After reading Lillian's note, Ken stood up abruptly, the chair scraping the floor with a loud, cutting noise. Angrily, he approached me, "Give the hosting spot to Lillian." I earned the hosting opportunity step by step with a lot of time and effort. I said coldly, why should I? Lillian is crying because she can't host. If you give her the spot, I'll spend a day with you at the amusement park on Saturday. He said it like it was a favor. I laughed out of anger. Why did Lillian's tears mean I had to give in? And was spending a day with him that big of a deal? I rolled my eyes. Move, you're blocking my fresh air. Ken gritted his teeth, seeming to make a decision. 2 days. How about that? I'll give you my whole weekend. What, are you selling yourself? He was speechless. If not, then get lost. I took out my test paper, just about to write, when he snatched it, crumpling it and tossing it on the floor. Do you really think you got that host spot fair and square? He shouted for the whole class to hear. Back then, it was just you and Lillian competing for the finals. So, you deliberately invited Lillian to barbecue 2 days before the finals to mess up her voice, ensuring she wouldn't perform well, right? I remembered that barbecue. But Lillian was the one who invited me. And at the barbecue place, she ordered all the spicy food. When it arrived, she suddenly said her stomach felt bad and couldn't eat, leaving it all for me. She ate steamed pears instead. So, her plan was to inflame my throat and make me perform poorly? Too bad for her, I'm not prone to sore throats. After eating, I competed as usual, beat her, and got the hosting gig. Everyone in class heard Ken loud and clear. Lillian's friends jumped on it immediately. Susan, what's Lillian done to you that you take her spot like that? She only mentioned her throat was off, but you totally stabbed her in the back. You should tell the student council you can't host, and give Lillian the chance. In my past life, I did give Lillian the spot. I hadn't switched seats with Ken, staying next to Lillian. Before rehearsal, she cried again. I asked what was wrong. She cried, my dad called me a failure for not getting the host spot, said he didn't have such a useless daughter. Susan, am I really that useless? Without the insight of another chance, like most classmates, I thought Lillian was the kind, helpful president. Seeing her cry over the spot, I figured hosting or not wouldn't affect me. So, I generously gave her the opportunity, you host. I'll just tell the council I lost my voice. Then your dad won't yell at you. She wiped her tears and quickly smiled. This time, she still wanted to use crying to get the host spot, but I wasn't giving it up. I looked at Lillian, still pretending to sleep, and asked, did our kind, beautiful, approachable, and helpful class president say this? Lillian moved a bit but stayed silent, not speaking up. Ken was furious, face red. I don't care who said it, I'm asking, are you giving Lillian the hosting spot or not? Oh, so he can get all worked up when someone else gets hurt? In our past lives, after marrying at 22, there was one time it rained, and we were trying to catch a cab home. I finally flagged one down, but just as I was about to get in, someone cut in and took it. I held on to the guy, arguing with him. He called me crazy and nearly punched me. Ken, instead of backing me up, said, stop arguing. It looks bad. Do you really need to take this cab? I was on my period, my stomach aching, and I just wanted to get home and rest. Yet there he was, showing off his gallantry to strangers. Looking back, he wasn't really that chivalrous. He just didn't care when it wasn't his loved one being wronged. This time, I'm not backing down. I stood up, coldly looking at Ken. We did go for barbecue, true, but that night I ate it all by myself. The class monitor didn't eat a single skewer. Don't lie just to dodge responsibility. I connected my phone to the multimedia system at the podium and played a video. From start to finish, the video showed me clearing the barbecue platter, while Lillian never touched any. The video was shot by the barbecue joint's owner, who thought I looked good and my eating was appetizing, so she wanted to use it for her social media. I declined but kept it as a keepsake. It came in handy now. The class went silent. Even Ken was stunned. While the supposed protagonist of the incident, Lillian, hadn't spoken a word, she suddenly spoke up, holding her stomach weakly. Ken, what are you doing? I'm crying because of period cramps. Why are you blaming Susan? Ken turned back to look at her, disbelief written all over his face. Lillian, you wrote on that note that. There were shredded pieces of paper on the ground. You misread, Lillian insisted. I have a stomachache, I'm going to the nurse. Friends who had defended Lillian now turned on Ken. Ken, what's wrong with you? Don't yell like that without knowing the facts. Don't waste our time next time, alright? Lillian, we'll go with you to the nurse. Ken stood there, dazed, watching Lillian walk away like a soul-stripped puppet. I knew that feeling too well. It's like when I first heard him say the book's female lead was Lillian. Something in me crumbled, the betrayal, the insult. I liked seeing him like this. Yet, Lillian's true face was beyond that. I'm curious about how he plans to love once he fully sees her and has his walls of love completely torn down. I'm waiting to see. The rehearsal and the event went smoothly. My co-host was Mason, a senior who had been accepted early admission to Cambridge and hadn't been around much. He was specially invited to host this event to draw in younger students. Backstage, after hosting all night, I was exhausted and slumped on the couch. Mason handed me a small bread roll. Here, have this first. I blinked at him, surprised. Thanks, Mason. He leaned against the table across from me and asked, "Where's your boyfriend?" I choked a bit. Mason handed me water. After a few sips, but before I could speak, Lillian burst in, "Susan, we came to see you." Ken followed. She glanced at Mason, blushed, and linked arms with me in mock affection. "Ken's been complimenting you all night but was too shy to see you alone, so he came with me." Ken stood near the door, 6 steps away from us. The room was noisy, he couldn't hear Lillian. He feels bad about the drama earlier but is too shy to say it, Lillian added. Ken did look our way, but not at me, he was gazing at Lillian. I wondered how she coaxed him. She's good at it. With her innocent looks, a smile could disarm anyone. That's how, in my past life, I thought Ken genuinely liked me. Now, I won't be fooled by such poor tricks. Before I could speak, Mason laughed. What was that for? Lillian sweetly asked. Sorry, couldn't help it, Mason shrugged. I've seen deliveries, but never someone delivering apologies. Lillian's cheeks reddened. Ken's just shy, and talks about Susan only in secret. The explanation was always the same, playing both sides. The simplest way to handle this was a confrontation. I huffed, really? Should I ask him? Before everyone, I turned to Ken and shouted, Ken, are you here to apologize to me? Ken froze. Lillian likely didn't expect me to confront directly and was also stunned. Susan, don't ask so outrightly. I didn't want an apology. Watching him wrestle with betrayal was more satisfying. Ken moved closer, and I asked, the class leader said you watched me all night. You came up to apologize? Apologize to you? Ken stiffly turned, clutching his sides tightly before his expression softened back toward Lillian. Lillian, that's not what you said. Lillian, sneaking a glance at Mason, began tearing up. Does it matter what we said earlier? It was a pathetic act. But Ken was hooked, the tension in his shoulders melting away, fists unclenching. He thought for a bit, then turned harshly on me, you're using Lillian, making me apologize. So nasty, Susan. I clapped, that's some spot on analysis, Ken. You're the real deal, an idiot in love. His face turned in shades, wanting to retort, but Mason cut him off. Got any more to say? We've got things to wrap up, Susan. Mason tugged on my sleeve, leading me away. When I looked back, Lillian was glaring resentfully at the spot where Mason was holding onto my shirt. The next day was the weekend. I slept all day at home and only got up at night to grab some food. The oily noodles I was craving were in the alley on the next street over. When I finished eating and stepped out, I spotted a familiar face slipping into another alley. There was a bar there. The bar owner often turns a blind eye to age, letting anyone in regardless of whether they're underage or not. Right then, Lillian was wearing a super short leather skirt, with sexy black thigh-high stockings. Her normally plain face was done up with smoky makeup, and her straight black hair was put up in dreadlocks. She looked sexy, completely different from the pure image she had at school. She stood at the bar's entrance, puffing away a bit, before heading in. I wasn't bothered by it at first, until I passed the bookstore and saw Ken and his friends coming out. Talk about good timing. "Ken," I called out, "I need to talk to you." He was holding his books, looking at me with contempt. "I don't have time to hang out with you today. I'm going home to read." I held back the urge to roll my eyes and came right out with it. "I just saw Lillian go into that bar in the alley." He looked at me with even more disgust. "Susan, wasn't it enough last time you used her? Now you're trying to smear her name again?" I shrugged. "I'm just trying to give you a heads up. If you don't hurry, she might get forced to drink." Ken got anxious and immediately ran towards the bar. I got myself a bubble tea before leisurely following him. I arrived just in time to see Ken getting kicked out of the bar by some thugs. "You're nuts," they jeered. "Have you read yourself, stupid?" Ken groaned on the ground, clutching his stomach. "You're the ones forcing Lillian to drink. Stay away from her." The thugs pounced, punching and kicking Ken as he tried to resist, until Lillian showed up in front of him. Chewing gum, she blew a bubble and said, "All right, stop. He's just my classmate." The thugs stopped immediately. Ken, beaten black and blue, struggled to get up and reach for Lillian's hand. "Lillian, let's go." Lillian shook his hand off with disgust. "Go where? Since you've seen it, you better know what to say and what not to say back at school." Dazed, Ken slid down to the ground, his body weak and limp. He shook his head slowly, mumbling, "No, that's not you. They're forcing you, right? Lillian, tell me they are. You're sick." Lillian spat out her gum. "Turns out Susan doesn't like you anyway. Worthless." She pointed at Ken. "Stay away from me. And if you spill one word about what you saw tonight, watch yourself." With that, she turned and headed back into the bar. Her group of friends followed, and the last one kicked Ken just for good measure. Ken didn't get up after. He lay there, staring blankly ahead, like a pile of useless flesh. Sipping my bubble tea, I sauntered over to marvel at his pathetic state. The double blow to his body and mind, witnessing his crush's image crumble and rot before his eyes. "Ken, you had it coming." I watched, satisfied, then turned to leave. Suddenly, his eyes focused, and he grabbed my wrist. "Dear Susan." Every drop of blood in me froze. There were people who called me Susan. Others called me Dear Susan. Only Ken, after we married in my last life, called me Dear Susan. He used to say, "Others call you Susan, so I'll call you Dear Susan." I turned back, stiff. His eyes filled with sorrow as he looked at me. "Have you abandoned me?" In that moment, memories of lying on the hospital bed as a vegetable flooded into my mind like a dam burst. The helplessness, disappointment, and piercing hurt. The remorse and powerlessness of being unable to change a thing. It all hit me hard, making me tremble all over. Back then, I was just an immobile body, forced to hear my beloved declare over and over how much he loved someone else. I had suffered both physically and emotionally. That was the darkest time before my death. I took deep breaths, suppressing the raging emotions. I kept telling myself, "It's okay, Susan. Even if he suddenly remembers everything, it's okay. This life is a fresh start. I won't go down the same path. I won't live through the agony of my past life again. There will be no more ties with him." I pried his hand off, one finger at a time. "I don't understand what you're saying." I hurried out of the alley. Ken shouted something after me, but with all the noise, I didn't catch it. Monday. Ken showed up in front of my desk with a bruised face but a bright smile, handing me breakfast. "Susan, I got you your favorite soup dumplings." I kept my face blank. "You're calling the wrong person." "Susan, once joyful and suitable," he said deliberately, staring at me, trying to read my face. But I simply looked at him emotionlessly. "What exactly are you trying to say?" Ken dropped his gaze, a bit disappointed, before forcing a smile. "It's okay if you don't remember. Susan, I've seen Lillian's true colors now. I won't let myself be stupid again. I'll treat you right this time." I ignored him and threw the breakfast into the trash right in front of him. His smile faltered, but he quickly persevered. "I get why you're mad after the way I acted. I won't give up. I'll always be good to you." After class, I had plans to meet Mason for a study session. But Ken insisted on tagging along. When we saw Mason, Ken guardedly positioned himself between us. "Susan, why are you meeting him alone?" he asked. "What's it to you?" I replied. He patiently explained, "There's stuff you may not know, but I'll tell you. We're going to get married eventually. Meeting other guys alone makes me jealous. Sometimes, I really want to call the cops." I ignored him and listened to Mason explaining the problems to me. But Ken kept interrupting, trying to make his presence known. Even though the room was air-conditioned, he kept fanning me with a worksheet. If he knew the answer, he butted in, "I know this one, Susan. I can explain it." When he didn't, he kept breaking Mason's flow. "Susan, thirsty? Susan, hungry?" Until our desk was piled high with drinks and snacks. Mason gave him a look. "What exactly are you doing here?" Ken straightened up, full of self-righteousness. "I'm here because I'm not comfortable leaving Susan alone." Mason smirked knowingly. "And what gives you that right? As far as I know, you're just a regular classmate. We're already married. She'll be my wife." A drink suddenly spilled all over Ken. Mason, with a straight face, said, "Sorry," slipped my hand. Later, to avoid Ken's harassment, Mason suggested we go to his place. His parents were abroad most of the year, so it was usually just him and the housekeeper. Mason lived in a fancy place with a solid security system, which wasn't easy to get through. Ken followed me sometimes but often got stopped outside the community. After discussing homework, my phone would buzz with messages from him. "Susan, I'm waiting downstairs. Mason's bad news. Don't hang out with him too much. If you want to do better in school, we can hit up some tutoring sessions with top tutors, okay? Susan, please, just come down and see me." I read the messages without much feeling, tossed my phone aside, and got back to my test prep. I've been avoiding Ken lately, treating him like a stranger in class and going to Mason's right after school to do more studying. I got home late today, and it started drizzling as I reached the neighborhood gate. Without an umbrella, I was using my bag to cover my head and dashed inside. Suddenly, I bumped into someone. "Sorry," I said quickly. "Susan." It was Ken. His voice was hoarse, hair soaked by the rain, eyes bloodshot. He grabbed my wrist. "Why are you avoiding me? What's so great about Mason that you hang out with him every day? You're supposed to marry me, you know that? Let me go." I tried to pull away. He gripped tighter. "Let you go? To where?" I said, "You're going to be my wife." He acted like we were already married, holding me tight, trying to kiss me. I raised my free hand and slapped him hard on the face. "Get away." Ken's head snapped to the side, but he still didn't let go. The rain poured harder, drenching us both. Then he suddenly laughed maniacally, his smile wide, and eyes blood red. "I get it. You're mad about what happened with Lillian, right? I understand. The next day at school, both Ken and Lillian were missing. After the fourth period, the teacher came in, looking serious and asked, "Does anyone know where Ken and Lillian are? I've tried contacting their families. They said both left for school early, but clearly, they didn't make it here." Their friends only knew some usual hangout spots. By afternoon, they still hadn't shown up. We searched everywhere they might be. The school had called the police and spread their info around, asking for any leads. The rain hadn't stopped, just coming down harder. I felt uneasy. After school, I got a message from Ken. "Ken, Susan, look, I settled it for you. Don't be mad, okay?" The picture showed Lillian with duct tape over her mouth, arms and legs tied. Her exposed skin was bruised, and she looked miserable. "Ken, be good, Susan. Come here, and I'll have her apologize to your face." Ken was extreme, always. Last time, he got dramatic for Lillian, even tried hurting himself, and then turned those stunts on me. He could do anything to make a point. I clenched my phone, replied, "Where are you?" Ken sent an address, saying, "Listen, come alone, or who knows what I'll do." Once I had the address, I called the cops. After learning about Ken's behavior, they asked me to follow his instructions to avoid scaring him off. They'd be shadowing closely. I took a cab. The rain was fierce, almost like it was flooding the city. Droplets raced down the window, making the outside hard to see. Ken had sent me to an abandoned warehouse on the city outskirts. It was well hidden, cars couldn't get in. I walked a long way through the rain, getting soaked by the time I reached the warehouse. Lillian was there, tied up, battered, helpless on the ground. Ken had a knife, hovering close to Lillian's neck. He seemed excited, a twisted look in his eyes. "Susan, listen, I'll make her apologize. If she does, then you'll stay with me, won't you?" He tore off the tape on Lillian's mouth, and dumped cold water on her face. "Repeat what we practiced." Lillian was out of it, staring at me for a while, then started laughing. "So, it's you? You're Susan. You think Ken really likes you?" "I made that up." She seemed unhinged, rambling to herself. "If I didn't lie to you, how else would you get distracted by him? How would Mason think you're taken? I'm clearly better than you. Why is Mason interested in you? Mason came to our class when he got that scholarship. I thought he was looking for me, but he was asking about you. I had no choice but to lie that you already had a boyfriend. To make it believable, I had to push you towards Ken. But this fool couldn't lure you, and now he's kidnapped me." Lillian was fiery by nature, never one to scare easily. She didn't care that Ken had her tied up. "I don't even want him, so why kidnap me?" So, Lillian made me think Ken was into me because she liked Mason and wanted Mason to think I was already involved. Ken growled, "I told you to apologize, not talk about Mason." She spat at him, all fiery. "Who do you think you are ordering me around?" That really ticked him off. Right now, Ken wasn't just any high schooler. He was Ken warped from my past with memories and a crazy, obsessive streak. He grabbed Lillian by the throat, apologized to Susan. Lillian's eyes rolled back as she choked, her tough front finally cracking. Sorry." Ken let her go, thrilled, and turned to me. "Susan, did you hear? She apologized, so will you be with me?" I looked down, my voice quiet but firm. "Ken, haven't you done anything wrong? You hurt yourself again and again to manipulate me. And I, trying to save you, got into that accident on my way home. Do you know, when that car hit me, I wasn't scared for myself. I was scared I couldn't save you." Ken's face went pale instantly. "Susan, do you remember everything too?" I kept talking. "Ken, when I was lying in that hospital bed, you kept telling me over and over again how much you loved Lillian. It was you who personally stabbed me, one cut at a time, over and over. Until I lost all hope, until I died with immense pain and regret. Now, here we go again. You're tormenting the most beautiful girl in your life, as you say, and claiming you love me. Isn't that ridiculous, Ken?" His whole body collapsed. He slid down to his knees, sobbing, I'm sorry, Susan." Outside, the police sirens wailed. Ken suddenly tightened his grip on the knife. "Don't be mad at me anymore. Let me give you one last gift, okay? He suddenly leaped up and ran towards Lillian, slicing through her Achilles tendons. Blood gushed from her feet. Lillian's agonizing screams echoed throughout the warehouse. Ken was taken away by the police. Lillian was rushed to the ambulance due to severe injuries. Mason showed up too. He ran straight to me. Are you okay? Are you hurt? It took me a moment to snap out of it and shake my head. I'm fine. The places where Ken and Lillian were thoroughly empty now. Ken was sentenced. Lillian, who was once a dance and art student, had her Achilles tendons severed. She can never dance again in this lifetime. She's still in the hospital recovering. After such a massive blow, her emotions are very unstable, and reportedly she's dealing with some mental issues. While treating her legs, a psychiatrist is also doing some intervention therapy. Mason continues to teach me. He's very strict during tutoring. When I space out, his pen taps my head. Are you still aiming for Cambridge? I hold the spot he tapped, frowning. I know this one. Oh. Then explain it to me. I start out pretty confidently, sounding all loud and clear. But my voice got quieter and quieter. Until it faded away. Mason, oh. Done? I glance down, feeling guilty. Seems like I don't know. Mason raises his hand, pretending to hit me, prompting me to quickly cover my head. In the end, he places his hand on my head, gently rubbing it a bit, with a bit of helplessness. Focus, Susan. You're still a bit off from Cambridge's acceptance line. I just have to focus more on these problems. Of course, Mason is pretty understanding when it comes to breaks. Sometimes, he even cooks a meal himself. Watching his busy back in the kitchen, I suddenly remember what Lillian said that day. Mason sought me out on the promotion day. Though in a previous life, because of Lillian's deliberate misguidance, plus later when I yielded the hosting position to her, we ended up having no connection. But it seems, even before that, I hadn't interacted with Mason. So why did he want to reach out to me? Mason, I called him. How did you know me? The soup simmered in the pot, steaming. Mason turned and leaned against the counter. There's a girl by the school's artificial lake, always reciting scripts to the plants. One day she didn't recite well to the grass, so the next day, she told the grass, you didn't perform well yesterday, so you have to stay by yourself for a day, while I go talk to the flowers. She didn't even spare the artificial swans. Once they waddled ashore, she chased after them reciting until the swan feathers almost got plucked clean. Initially, I listened, puzzled. Then the more I listened, the redder my ears got. That person, seems like it was me. I was interested in broadcasting at that time, but worried about disturbing my roommates, I went to a quiet corner by the artificial lake to practice. I thought no one was there. Mason chuckled a bit. There were no people, but upstairs there were. At that time, he was honing his competition skills, pretty exhausting. During breaks, he always saw a girl by the lake chasing swans. Not catching up, she broke into a sweat but was still grinning. His lips couldn't help but smile as well. The fatigue from competing seemed to lessen in that moment. Later on, watching her chase swans became routine. Until the competition ended, he gained a guaranteed spot and found out the girl's name was Susan. It's just that, the girl seemed to have a little boyfriend. When the principal called, inviting him to host a gala, he wasn't that interested until he heard his partner would be Susan. I thought, Mason said, looking at me, it wouldn't hurt to leave a mark with you, even if it was just co-hosting. Luckily, he suddenly smiled, his eyes kind. Hosting led to an unexpected result. Turned out having a boyfriend was a misunderstanding. My nose suddenly stung. I clenched my fist with resolve. Mason, wait for me at Cambridge, I'll get in. He came over and ruffled my hair. I believe you. I was about to tease and ask if he saw potential in me. Mason, after all, you're the only one in school who chases swans every day. After college entrance exams, the school posted the honor roll, and my name appeared right under Cambridge University. I snapped a pic and sent it to Mason. I did it. All those dark, unbearable days, I endured them all. From now on, may all our wishes come true and our paths be smooth. Bless everyone.